Okay, so this is our first uh, parsha of leading before Yom Kippur, Parshas Haazinu, and just a few thoughts on the parsha as we get into it. I saw something. Parshas Haazinu has always been very challenging parsha to really understand because it's poetry and it's easier in a certain sense to relate to the parts of the Torah. They're certainly easier to understand, to translate the parts that are prose rather than poetry, because poetry is always harder. But I did see a very powerful idea from the Rebbe, from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which I wanted to share. After he shared this powerful idea from the Rebbe, I wanted to look at the opening midrash of the Midrash Rabbah on Parshas Haazinu. It's a powerful midrash. And after we look at the opening midrash, I wanted to look at the Baal HaTurim on the opening verse of Parshas Haazinu. And after we look at the opening midrash at the Baal HaTurim, then I wanted to look at some commentary on Kishem Hashem Ekra V'Godel Elokeinu, which is a powerful verse in our portion. There's a mitzvah that's related to that. And if we have time, we'll share some thoughts about Yom Kippur. Hopefully we have a few thoughts to share. Everybody can be inspired going into Kol Nidre, which is tomorrow night. So again, the parsha of Haazinu begins with the words Haazinu Hashemayim V'Adaber V'Tishma Haaretz Imrei. And actually, even before we get to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I always like to show where there's a relationship between that parsha and the upcoming days. And so we'll just look very briefly. We'll come back to this hopefully at the end. Very briefly at the verse, Kishem Hashem Ekra V'Godel Elokeinu, that it says, "For this is the name of God, Kishem Hashem Ekra." When I proclaim the name of God, you have to ascribe greatness to God by blessing His name. So, what does this mean? Kishem Hashem Ekra V'Godel Elokeinu. So the Rashi's commentary is as follows. It says, Hare ki, the word ki, Mishamesh B'Lashon Kasher. The word ki can mean, we know it can mean four things in the Torah, and so here it means as the expression of when, as in when you come into the land. Kishe'akreh va'askir et Shem Hashem. When I go out and mention the name of God, atem havu godel elokinu. You have to talk about the greatness of God's name, ubaruchu shemo, and bless His name. And from here we see that people have the custom to say Baruchu Baruch Shemo, but Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi says Mikan Amru. From here we say Shonin Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto, that after God's name was recited in the temple, Achar Bracha Shebamikdash, after a blessing in the temple, you have to recite Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Blessed be God's glorious name forever and ever. Now, normally, whenever we recite that phrase, we recite it quietly. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. We recite it as part of the Shema, because it's not really part of the Shema, but it's maybe it's a prayer of the angels. We don't want them to say it, but on Yom Kippur, we don't want them to know that we received this secret prayer. But on Yom Kippur, we recite this prayer out loud. So normally the practice is understood because on Yom Kippur, we say we're like angels. So therefore we have the permission to recite this phrase, blessed be His glorious kingdom, and be blessed. Blessed be the name of the glory of His kingdom forever and ever. But on Yom Kippur, we recite this phrase out loud when we recite the Shema. And another reason why we recite it out loud is because during the service of Yom Kippur, we're four times we recite this name out loud. Because what we do is we go through the drama of the liturgy, and we act out how the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would recite a confession. And whenever the high priest would recite a confession, it says, and when he said the Shem HaMefurash, when he recited the name of God, he would say the name of God. Whenever he said the name of God out loud, the actual name of God, which nobody today knows how to say. When he would say the actual name of God, the people would bow down and chant on the top of their voices, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, so that nobody would hear it. So, because we're concerned that the name of God could fall into the hands of people who are not worthy to be reciting this, using the name of God. The name of God is such a powerful spiritual force that it could be misused in the wrong hands. Spirituality is very dangerous, and a person who has access to the power of spirituality but misuses it, it could be a very, very dangerous tool. So we recite this 3 times during the confessional prayers of Yom Kippur, when the Kohen Gadol confesses for his family and himself, when the Kohen Gadol confesses, secondly, for all of the Kohanim, and thirdly, when he confesses for all the children of Israel, he would say the name of God and say, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, and everybody would bow down and they would drown out the name of God, so nobody could hear it. And there's a 4th time we say it during the repetition of the Amidah, when we say the Aleinu prayer, Aleinu L'Shabeach, and during that prayer also we fall on our hands and knees, and when we say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. So those are the 4 times we chant this phrase on Yom Kippur. And also we're told in the Gemara in the Jerusalem Talmud that Rabbi Tarfon said that when he was in the temple, he was a younger Kohen, he would try to inch next to the Kohen Gadol to hear the Kohen Gadol actually say the prayer. He would try to come as close as possible to hear it, but he wouldn't be able to because everybody would drown out. I have this beautiful image, Rabbi Tarfon, the great Rabbi Tarfon, the Kohen, the Gemara discusses in Kesubos whether he was a student or a teacher of, or a colleague or a teacher of Rabbi Akiva. This great Rabbi Tarfon would try desperately to hear the name of God, but it was unable to be heard because it was very carefully guarded secret. Even Rabbi Tarfon, the great sage, had to try to hear it in this manner. So this is the concept of and that's when we're saying this phrase, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, we're fulfilling this verse when I Kishem Hashem Ekra, before I call out in the name of God, Havu Godol Eloheinu. You have to give, when I call out in the name of God, you have to express the greatness of God by blessing his name, by reciting this phrase, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. So now, just to go back, what is this portion of Haazinu all about? What is this passage about? So I want to read just a few paragraphs from Lubavitcher Rebbe, because the Rebbe is always so beautiful, and here the Rebbe makes a profound point, which I think is also a message for us on Yom Kippur. Because there's another verse in here. There's another powerful verse. I mean, every verse is powerful, but there's another verse that you might be especially familiar with, unfortunately, Rahmano Litzlan. This is the 4th verse of the portion, which states, Hatzur Tamim Palo, the rock perfect in every ways are his actions. Kikol Durachav Mishpat, all his ways are just. Kel Emunah Ve'in Avo, the God of faith without sin. Tzadik V'yasharhu, the God is righteous. Some of you, unfortunately, might be familiar with that prayer because that is a verse that is recited at funeral services. Whenever we do a funeral service, whenever we go to a funeral, Rahman al-Islam, this is the prayer that's called Tziduk Hadin. And at the Levaya, the prayer Tziduk Hadin is recited, which is a statement that even when we bury someone, we recognize, especially at that moment, how God's ways are just and appropriate. And so here, within this poem of Haazinu, which comes to the end of the parsha, and here we have these verses, the verse of talking about God being perfect. Why is that included? So listen to what the Rebbe says. The Rebbe writes, as an introduction to the parsha, and I heard from the editors of this Chumash that it was especially important to them that they wanted to make sure that the Rebbe's introduction to the parsha is always included. So they say at the beginning that this parasha Haazinu is almost entirely a poem, and in this poem, Hashem tells Jewish people Haazinu, which means hearken or listen to God's words, as God wants us to learn from history. God warns us of the consequences of violating the terms of the brit. If we violate the terms of the brit, of the covenant, we will have tremendous consequences. And God also reminds the Jewish people, God reminds the Jewish people that the purpose of all the troubles we've had in history is ultimately to bring us closer to our ultimate redemption. So the Rebbe notes, of course, that this sounds like several of the other portions that we've been reading in Deuteronomy, meaning to say, warning us that if we don't follow the ways, we're going to have troubles, and ultimately this will be leading us closer to redemption. So what does Haazinu add, that was not covered in the previous passages in the Torah? What does Haazinu add? So this is the Rebbe writing. He says the answer might be the fact that Haazinu is a poem, which is a poem in the Torah. If you think about the poems in the Torah, they're usually used to express joy. Like the most famous is Az Yashir. They sang joy, words of joy and praise, expressing tremendous praise to God and thankfulness. I was just speaking with my teacher, Rabbi Weiss, and Rabbi Weiss said to me, how come it is, this is just a tangent, Rabbi Weiss said to me, how come it is that the additional prayers of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur don't have expressions of thanksgiving to God? They're talking about God's greatness, but they don't have expressions of giving thanks to God. That's a separate question. If you remind me, we could take up that question. I can share with you the answer that I thought it was when he asked me that question. But anyway, the question is that usually, the Rebbe says, usually a poem in the Torah represents praise to God. So this passage of Haazinu was divided. The poem was divided into six separate passages in the Beit HaMikdash, and so they would read a different passage every week. And it says this in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah 13a. They would read a different passage every week, and they would complete this poem over a 6-week period. That's what Gemara Rosh Hashanah Yud Gimel 13a talks about. Now, the Rebbe asked the question, and this is the point of why the Rebbe really hit me so hard or so powerfully, that we know you're not allowed to be sad on Shabbos. Well, you know you're not allowed to be sad on Shabbos. So why was this Haazinu prayer poem specifically chosen to be read on Shabbos in the temple? You're not supposed to be sad on Shabbos. You're not supposed to read the sad passages you're not supposed to read sad passages on Shabbos. So why specifically was this passage of Haazinu selected to be read in the temple on Shabbos? And you say, okay, you might say, well, guess what? You know what? The passage of Haazinu is not completely sad because it's not completely sad because the opening is positive and the middle and the end is positive. He says, look, my words are going to fall down. Ascribe greatness. God is reliable. These are positive passages. But the middle is certainly problematic because it says, look, just for example, Vayishman Yeshurun Vayivat Shamanta Vita Kasita. And just looking at it, it says the Yeshurun, the people, the Jewish people became fat and rebellious. You became fat and thick, covered with fat. The nation forsook God, who made it and scorned the rock of its salvation. Vayinabel tzur Yeshua so yakni eu bezarim betoevot yachisuhu. That they provoked him to jealousy. They angered him. They engaged in abominable acts. They sacrifice to demons of no utility. And then Pasuk Yudchet, Tzur Yoadcha, Tashi, Vatishkach Kel Mecholecha, that you have forgotten God, the rock who gave birth to you. You've forgotten God. And verse 19, Vayar Hashem Vayinatz, God saw this, he was disgusted. Mikas Banav Ubenosav, his sons and daughters had angered him. And what does he say? Vayomer Astira Panai Mehem, Er'eh Macharitam. I'll hide my face from them. I'll see what will happen to them. Kidor Tapuchotema. They are a generation that is transformative in a bad way. Banim lo uman bam. They are children who are uneducated. So the whole middle part of this portion is very, very negative. And it's only towards the end of the paragraph, the end of the poem, that we start to see that God is coming around, and it's positive. It says, towards the end, it says, Ki ani eno kimi madi ani amitzach yem achatzi v'ani arpeh. I will heal. V'imi yadi mitzil. Ki asa el shamayim yadi v'marti chay anochi la'olam. God says, I will live forever, and I will pray. Verse 41. Ashiv nakam utzarai u'mesanai ashalim. So at the end, God is saying that he will punish those nations that are rebelling against God. And the last verse of the poem is Harninu goyim amo kidam avadav yikom v'nakam yashiv utzarav v'chiper ad mato amo. And the last verse, God said, Moshe says, God will avenge the blood of his servants. He'll take vengeance on his enemies, and he'll appease the land by appeasing his people. So fine, yeah, at the end of the verse, at the end of the song, God, it's all going to turn out good. But in the middle, it's terrible. It's terrible. So why is this passage the passage that's selected to be read in the temple every single week for 6 weeks? What's the reasoning there? So the Rebbe writes as follows. He says, this is what the Rebbe says. He says, it appears at the point of reading the poem over a span of 6 weeks, thereby dividing it into 6 sections, is precisely to emphasize this point, that even the retributive content of the poem is meant to be understood as part of the whole, a paean of praise to God. Meaning to say, even the retribution is a tremendous praise to God. What does he mean by that? He says as follows, and this is the key paragraph, which is, I think, something that we bear in mind every day on Yom Kippur. This is the key phrase. What does the Rebbe say? The Rebbe says like this. Thus, the purpose of this poem is not just to review the covenant that we have with God, but as Moses says after the poem, pay close attention to all these words that I testify to you today. Pay close attention. That's the passage. I'll read the Hebrew. This is 3 psukim after the end of the thing. He says, Moshe says, pay attention to all these words. We are bidden to consider all these things and draw the proper conclusions. This poem and its message that God takes our commitment seriously and that our behavior can determine the course of history are meant to infuse our lives and our relationship with God with enthusiasm, focus, and yes, even joy. So the basic promise of this portion is something that will ultimately lead us to a joyful life. And that is that if we take what this poem is about the basic fundamental idea of Judaism, which is that our actions can impact the universe, and that our actions are able to have an impact on the whole world, and that God takes our commitment to God seriously, and that our behavior can determine the course of history. What a powerful idea. that your life has meaning, that our lives have meaning. That's what the Rebbe is basically saying is the purpose of this parasha, to remind us that our lives have meaning. And yes, sometimes if we don't act properly, there can be tremendously bad consequences to our mistakes. But the basic fundamental idea of Parashas Haazinu is that our lives have meaning and we can impact the world for good if we take the teachings of the Torah seriously. And that's why this is selected as the conclusion to almost the conclusion to the entire Torah portion. That's the teaching of the Rebbe. So first of all, I want to pause here, see if anybody has any questions.